Hey everyone, I want to tell you about a recently published paper about a unique set of ecological experiments that might be demonstrating the processes of evolution right before our eyes. In the very late summer and early fall of 2017, research scientist Colin Donahue was on the islands of Turks and Caicos in the Caribbean, doing field sampling of Anolis scriptus lizards. These are small little lizards that live in trees. Donahue left the islands to return to Boston, and 4 days after his departure, Hurricane Irma made landfall. The storm brought devastation, not just to human communities, but to the vegetation and animal populations as well. Shortly afterward, Hurricane Maria came and hit the islands, and this was even worse, with stronger winds and much more devastation. These sequential storms applied heavy and persistent pressure to the island's ecology for more than a month. And 6 weeks after Irma made landfall, Colin Donahue and his associates went right back to work, sampling lizards, even walking along the exact same routes to sample lizards from the exact same study sites, so as to make the before and after samples as comparable as possible. They examined these sampled lizards and took measurements of their tail length, their torso length, their weight, the size of their arms and legs and their torsos, and they took pictures of their toe pads. These were the same traits that were measured in the earlier sample of lizards, and it allowed the researchers to compare them as being representative of pre- and post-storm populations. What they discovered was that the storm survivors had smaller body sizes, but they also had larger toe pads on all their feet. Furthermore, their hind limbs were shorter, and their forelimbs were longer, perhaps for whatever reason that made them better able to hang on. These clusters of morphological traits were seen in populations on both the islands. Now, there have been other studies examining Anolis lizard behavior that have found that when the lizards are exposed to strong winds, they don't hide away in a crevice or crawl to the ground to burrow away. They generally tend to move to the opposite side of the tree or the branch or whatever structure they're on to avoid as much of the brunt force of the wind as possible, and then they just hunker down and hold on as tight as possible for as long as they can. If this is also the case for the wild lizards in Donahue's sample studies, then it would stand to reason that stronger limbs and gripping pads would help, as would a smaller body that has less surface area for the wind to push against. This study would then be a case of evolution in action, where natural selection has rapidly worked upon the reptiles' bodies, culling those that aren't fit enough to withstand the hurricanes. While this is a really interesting possibility, it's not necessarily that simple. It could be that what Colin Donahue observed in the before and after populations just ends up being an evolutionary hiccup that doesn't really make a big difference to anything. I mean, it's possible that the trait sizes just normalize after a generation or two. Alternatively, if this is natural selection in action, then we have to wonder how long it will persist if the lizards aren't exposed to any more major storms like Irma and Maria. If this is a one-time thing and not a perpetual selection pressure, its imprint on the species' evolution will be minor and temporary. There's another alternative that's quite probable, which is that this is not natural selection in action, but instead is a case of sampling bias. In the study, they described their methods, and they didn't collect dead lizards for measurement. They didn't account for the missing lizards at all, and they only presumed them to be dead. It's possible that they were simply thrown on the wind somewhere else, like to another part of the islands, or to entirely different islands. This kind of airborne transport of reptiles and amphibians during a storm sounds kind of comical and ridiculous, but it actually happens pretty often. So what do you think? Is this a case of natural selection in action? And if it is, do you think that this selection pressure will persist? I think that it might, given that the fact that climate change produces more frequent and more intense storms. And so, because these were in 2017, we're really only seeing the beginning of this kind of stuff. Or alternatively, do you think that this study is not natural selection, but is instead a mere case of sampling bias?